Expedition. True stories of man's quest for the unknown. Through the steaming jungles. Across the burning desert. To the depths of treacherous seas. And to the highest mountains of the world. Expedition. Actual films of the great expeditions of our time, recorded as they happened. Your host is the famous deep-sea diver, author, and explorer, Colonel John D. Craig. And here is Colonel Craig.
Our story tonight is one of raw courage. We'll see an expedition led by a Jesuit priest go straight into the heart of an active Alaskan volcano, the biggest live crater in the world. We call our film In the Valley of the Shadow of Death. In May 1931, a volcano in Alaska erupted with such terrible force that rocks the size of a house were thrown 20,000 feet in the air and a rain of ashes blanketed the area for hundreds of miles. The glacier priest, Father Bernard Hubbard, had predicted this eruption. Geologist as well as priest, Father Hubbard also felt that a still active volcano could answer many questions. But a scientific party had to get in and out alive, and that's exactly what he and his men tried to do. With poisonous fumes swirling all around them and red-hot lava right beneath their feet, they spent 3 solid weeks in the crater. Here now is Father Hubbard to tell the story of this historic achievement.
In the summer of 1931, I just left the Aleutians for Seward when Aniakchak blew its top. I decided to go there just as soon as a man could get in. From Seward, it was a 400-mile run to Kodiak Bay. That's the closest landing point to the Aniakchak Crater. In those days, Seward wasn't much of a place and transportation was scarce. I put out a call, but all my bush pilot friends were off somewhere, so we did the next best thing. We found an old fishing boat, just about able to carry its own gear. It was small and smelled pretty strong, but it was better than waiting around for a bush plane. Over 30 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. It was cold and gray, and the dogs didn't like being tied down on deck at all. They made a lot of noise. That was no fun for them. Little Wolf, McGeek, and the rest, they always hated going over water. They liked flying even less. But at least it was faster. I don't blame them. A bush plane could have made the same run in 4 or 5 hours instead of 4 days. Food was rationed. The dogs got dried caribou once a day. We figured there wouldn't be much game around the volcano, so we had to stretch our provisions. The weather wasn't too bad the first 48 hours, but then it closed in. Freezing rain turned into sleet, and our dogs were miserable, soaked to the skin, shivering, cold, and seasick. This lasted for a good 48 hours, with the boat pitching and rolling and the dogs just plain uncomfortable. They'd mushed thousands of miles without a whimper, but this was too much. On the 4th day, it cleared up a bit, and we reached Kodiak Bay. I don't remember how much I paid the captain, but it wasn't anything like what it would cost now. Those were Depression days, and the pickings were slim. The dogs were awfully glad the voyage was over, so with tails wagging, they went into the dinghy. We had no idea what lay ahead of us. Not the faintest. The storm had left fresh snow here. We brought a sled in hopes we could mush at least part way to the crater. We set up camp and went looking for fresh meat. The fishermen joined us. I went ahead. Even here, everything was coated with a sticky black ash from the volcano's eruption. The fishermen knew how to climb around the boat, but they were out of their element here. So we helped with alpine methods to get them to the top. No people lived here now, but obviously long ago Eskimo or Aleutian hunters camped here. We discovered ancient symbols they'd carved in the rock. Petroglyphs, they're called. They probably date back 1,000 years or more. Then I heard some grunting and scratching on ahead and climbed up to investigate. And there were 2 Kodiak bear cubs scratching in the loose rubble and volcanic cinders. It's kind of unusual to see bear cubs left all alone by themselves, and I wondered where the mother was. Even armed, I wouldn't want to meet her in the rocks. Those little bears could give us lessons in climbing. We saw no other game that day, and so returned to camp empty-handed. But it didn't really matter. We'd have fish for dinner. 2 days later, as we were camped by a lonely lake, we had a pleasant surprise. My old friend Frank Dorbent had gotten the word that we were on our way to Aniakchak. He insisted on flying us and our dogs right to the crater. That would save at least 3 of us a long and painful trek. But Dorbent had something else in mind. He didn't want to fly just to the Aniakchak Crater, but right into it. If he could find a small lake inside the crater, he'd try to land us there. The others would have to pack in. I waved a cheerful goodbye to the rest of the party, but frankly, I was scared. So we were off for the first attempted landing in a volcano, the world's largest active crater. This region was rugged and at that time uncharted. Flying here was dangerous. Remember, I filmed all this in 1931. A rolling sea of clouds hid the gaping canyons below. The mountain peaks were sharp and the air bumpy. If we had to make a forced landing in one of the canyons, we'd be out of luck. Nobody would ever find us in this no man's land. The first sight of Aniakchak's interior took my breath away. It wasn't just a crater. It looked like a whole world of live craters and lakes and black cones within a gigantic bowl. The way Dorbent flew was a severe test of faith. But we didn't hit the crater walls. We banked, swept along a narrow band of muddy water, turned again, and leveled out over a small lake dotted with black cinder cones. The snow-covered mountains are actually the outer rim of the volcano, seen from the inside. And so we made it, the first successful landing inside an active volcano. Frank's remarkable flight didn't impress the dogs one bit. They were just glad to be on land. And so we set up camp in this world all our own, waiting for the rest of the party to pack in. There was Aniakchak, and we were right in it. It's almost impossible to get a real idea of the tremendous size of this crater. Sometime in the past, this huge bowl was a volcanic mountain 100 times the size of Vesuvius. A terrific explosion centuries ago blew the entire thing into the air, leaving a hole big enough to hold its own hills, rivers, lakes, and live craters. There's fire and ice side by side, surrounded by 3,000-foot snow-covered walls. The latest eruption had come from just one area within this circle. A week later, the rest of the men finally arrived. It was a great feeling to have everybody together again, safe and sound. That is, if you can be safe and sound inside an active crater. We celebrated with a deluxe banquet. Prunes, pancakes, mush, and caribou steaks all at the same time. McGeek always played for attention. If he couldn't get it barking, he'd try the other end. And if that didn't work, he'd try both ends at once. Then began a week of reconnaissance and exploration. The V-shaped opening in the distance is the gateway into the crater. I couldn't imagine a scene of more desolation. Lava bombs thrown off by the eruption had made this vast plain inside the crater look like a war-torn battlefield. Volcanic shrapnel, huge blocks of rock thrown thousands of feet into the air. Surely Aniakchak was the biggest cannon in the world. The black ash completely covered the snow that fell last winter. Walking on the loose cinders was like trying to climb a pile of sliding wheat. We reached the far edge of our lake and discovered a clear spring. The lava flow was a frightening spectacle, with steam and poisonous gases rising into the air. Walking on the upthrust lava wasn't too bad. Although tremendous heat was imprisoned only a few feet below the surface, the porous crust acted as insulation. We were impressed with our own courage, but how tame it seemed to us later when we reached our goal at the bottom of the pit of Hades. Miles of exploring brought us something new and extraordinary every day. One by one, we measured and studied the gaping pits blown out of the crater floor. All of them were immense chemical laboratories where the deadliest gases known to man were being formed. Fortunately, by the time the poisonous fumes got to the top, the wind had diffused them enough to make them more or less harmless. But that same wind also blew the fine black ash around like powder. It got into our eyes and mouths, made breathing difficult. It would try the patience of a saint. We weren't fit to be associated with it. At the end of the day, it was hard to pick the dirtiest. Take your choice. Levin the prize fighter, Peterson the hunter, or Hubbard the priest. It was stay dirty or jump in the ice-cold lake. We chose cleanliness. So passed our first days in Aniakchak, dirty and exhausted. But sometimes at night, the moon brought a sort of magic, and then you could almost forget that you were living within the walls of a blown-out mountain. The morning of our great venture into the pit of Hades dawned bright and clear. The distant smoke, the lava flows, the snow-covered walls lay reflected in the still beauty of the crater lake. We began the day with the sacrifice of the Mass in our volcanic sanctuary. I particularly treasure this bit of film, taken inside that live crater over 30 years ago.
It took a lot of courage just to go into that crater, and they still have the most dangerous place to explore. Father Hubbard called it the Pit of Hades.
On the opposite side of the crater, ominous clouds of steam and gas rose into the calm sky. That was the Pit of Hades, the biggest and most dangerous live crater of them all, the major objective of our expedition. The first time we saw this terrible place, we determined to descend to the very bottom. Down in that erupting chaos, precious scientific data could be obtained, and we wanted it. As we stood on the brink, our courage weakened. Steam and poisonous gases seethed and hissed 600 feet below, cooked by the fires of hell. We knew that at any moment, Aniakchak could blow up into another of its terrific explosions. Even a small eruption would have wiped us from the face of the earth. From the grim depths of the crater, gases too heavy to rise rolled and tossed like waves in a ghostly sea. This was indeed an antechamber of hell. We'd saved our biggest delicacy, a nice, juicy ham, for this last great occasion. McGeek, our blue-eyed dog, was already licking his chops in anticipation. Water for cooking was no problem. Plenty of clean snow under the ashes. And as for heat, we didn't have to worry about that either. The volcano would do our cooking for us. Locating a good spot to leave our ham to boil was no trouble at all. If we got out of the pit alive, it'd be a great feast. And if we didn't, what of it? To estimate the width and depth of the pit, we hit on a novel method. A shot from Peterson's gun and the echo across the pit were clocked by stopwatch. Some rapid calculations based on the speed of sound gave us 3 miles as the circumference of the pit. This meant there was sufficient room for downdrafts of pure air to diffuse the gases at the bottom. We now believed we had a fighting chance to get in and out alive, if our calculations were correct. Down and down we went, dwarfed to the size of ants by that immense bowl of visible steam and invisible poison gases. We were reassured by the downdrafts, but could they thin out the gases sufficiently? That was the big question. Faithful McGeek and Klondike followed us down. Their instincts told them not to go into that awful place, but their loyalty to us urged them on. Ed Levin was at the end of the rope, yelling up that so far he smelled only hydrogen sulfide, dangerous but carrying its own offensive warning. It's the odorless, colorless gases that are the quick finishers, even though the visible ones look more terrifying. We were just about halfway down now. The gigantic vaporous ring was right in front of us, but we were still in loose volcanic ash. The lava got rougher and broken, warped into caves, cliffs, and canyons by the terrific eruption, filling our bags with volcanic samples collected right at the source. The dogs acted as our gas detectors. Since they were so close to the ground where the lethal gases concentrate, they would be affected first. By watching them carefully, we could heed their warning and take them and us to safety. It felt as though we were breathing tiny feathers. Our heads were beginning to swim with dizziness. We kept praying for just one little spot of clear, fresh air, but instead it got worse. The acrid smoke and dust burnt your mouth and nose, and it was torture just to keep your eyes open. We moved as quickly as we could to get out of this bad spot, but the steam and fumes were so thick we constantly lost sight of each other and the dogs. We kept yelling to each other, but it was pointless. We could hardly hear ourselves shout, much less the others. We were desperately worried that the dogs might become separated from us. With all the chemical odors, it would have been impossible for them to follow our scent. I found myself repeating the words from the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. Now we were at the level of the heaving crater floor, the lid insecurely fastened over the cauldrons of hell. When Ed Chisholm tried to take the temperature, the glass thermometer melted, too hot. But he collected important salts and minerals for analysis. In a pocket where the gas had cleared away, I found a dead bird. We still wanted to know how hot it was. Glass thermometers were useless, so we put copper discs on the end of our picks. They had a melting point of 1,080 degrees centigrade and melted quickly. By the way, that was the highest temperature ever recorded inside an Alaskan volcano. It was like walking on the lid of a gigantic boiling kettle with the steam roaring out around its edges. It was a fearful thought that at any moment the kettle might boil over and there was no one to turn the fire off. More and more clearly we could hear and feel the dull thud of underground explosions which made the crust shudder beneath our feet. And every time a fresh cloud of smoke and steam burst out around the edge, we felt the whole thing was going to blow up right under us. The final minutes of our work, frantically testing, digging, and collecting samples. We were taking an awful beating. Hair and eyebrows singed, shoes cracked open, eyes burning and smarting, lungs aching. We staggered along the furnace walls, grabbing mineral specimens where we could. But even as we continued to work, more and more the feeling of unreality came over us. I don't know if it was the prolonged exposure to the poison gases or the approach of total exhaustion, but I had an overpowering desire to lie down and go to sleep, and the others felt the same. It was as though we were all living through the same nightmare, lost souls from the pages of Dante's Inferno. We knew we should stop and get out, and yet we prolonged the danger. We couldn't help a feeling of strange exaltation, and I still feel it, even today, more than 30 years after I made these films. We were young and foolish, perhaps, but we accomplished something of importance for the science of volcanology. By venturing 600 feet to the bottom of the pit of Hades, we had collected precious information on the nature of active volcanoes. And perhaps most important, in that terrible crater, we learned something which served us in all the years to come. It was more than a victory over Aniakchak. It was a victory over ourselves. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
Father Hubbard's exploration of Aniakchak volcano was one of his most daring exploits. In over 30 years of exploring Alaska, he did many other amazing things. He explored the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. He climbed Katmai, Shishaldin, and many other live Alaskan volcanoes. He mushed a dog team for 1,600 miles across the Arctic wilderness, and on the last 100 miles, he was delirious with a raging fever. He made a 2,000-mile voyage in a walrus skin boat to study the Eskimos. And through all these incredible adventures and hardships, he still managed to give us, as a permanent record, millions of feet of film and hundreds of thousands of photographs. We owe a great deal to this dedicated explorer priest, Father Bernard Hubbard. From the smoking volcanoes of Alaska, we go on our next exciting expedition halfway around the world on an entirely different quest. Take my word for it, we'll begin our story after this brief but important message. This, too, is a dramatic adventure. Until then, this is John Craig saying thank you and good night.